Like and subscribe to my channel and click the bell icon to get new video updates.
Analysis: Why strike-shy Britain is gripped by industrial action. Britain is not used to the waves of labour unrest that can be a fact of life in countries where the right to strike is enshrined in law. Until recently, it seemed as if coordinated industrial action was largely a thing of the past, thanks in part to anti-union reforms pushed through by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. But as the cost of living soars, and even some people with jobs turn to food banks for food, hundreds of thousands of British workers are using their collective bargaining power to demand higher wages. Much of the unrest is centered in state sectors, where successive Conservative governments have tried for many years to limit wage growth in a bid to curb national borrowing, with strikes erupting in the first half of 2022 as inflation soared and finally reached over 11%, one of the highest rates in Europe, and plunged many working people into poverty. Unions say wages need to rise to meet rising costs for food, energy, clothing and shelter. Some of the strikes are taking place in privatized or partially privatized services, such as postal delivery and public transport, where the potential damage from service disruptions is leveraged to demand better wages and working conditions. Analysis from Bloomberg Economics puts the cost to the UK economy at £1.5 billion in 2022, moderate downside risk to Q1 GDP. In these two periods, about 20 to 30 million working days were lost to strikes. By comparison, Capital Economics estimated that December 2022 may have lost 1.5 million days. Even if this repeated every month, it won't measure up to the disruption of the 1970s. It refused to pay wage demands and conjured up memories of Thatcher, who gutted the power of union bosses in the 1980s, believing they would blackmail the country and block needed economic reforms. We must get union barons to think twice before they use the strike weapon and close Margaret Thatcher's unfinished business, Business Secretary Grant Shapps wrote on Twitter. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak intervened by introducing legislation to enforce minimum service levels and make it harder for essential workers such as firefighters, teachers, train drivers and nuclear plant engineers to quit work. The proposed legislation has angered union leaders, who say it would allow employers to sack workers for going on strike. A botched economic plan blew up the UK bond market in September, and Sunak was keen to restore fiscal credibility to the Conservatives. Big wage increases would widen a government deficit already bloated by COVID-related costs and government support for household and business energy bills. Ministers also argue that higher wages would fuel inflation and make everyone worse off. There could be another reason why the government wants to endure the strikes. They are not as effective as they used to be. This is offset by an additional cost of £7.5 billion if public sector wages were to rise by 5% to 8%. According to Capital Economics, the anti-strike law will likely take months to take effect and will not cover services like mail delivery, which accounted for more strike days in December than transportation and the National Health Service. If labour unrest spreads, it will further weigh on the UK economy, which has been slowed by rising borrowing costs and new trade barriers with the European Union. Britain is the only nation in the group of 7 with an economy that is still smaller than it was before the pandemic. One reason the strikes may continue is that many workers believe the public has sympathy for their cause and shares their call for more investment in public services. Around 2/3 of those polled in YouGov polls consistently supported the nurses' strikes. Half of the public supported teacher strikes, as Savanta poll showed in February, while only 30% opposed it. Unions in the UK face stricter strike rules than in most other European countries. Unions must overcome further hurdles to order a strike and are prohibited from engaging in secondary action, where workers strike in sympathy with workers from another employer.